Okay, welcome to the Statistics Lab number 1 results video. So if you recall from last time, we collected some data based on the Maltby, McCaskill, and Day article, and we were asking the question, do people take longer to pull out, are men and women more forgiving of themselves, more forgiving of others, and have higher or lower emotional empathy? And during class, we talked about specific hypotheses. So we might predict, for example, that men will be more forgiving of others than women, or vice versa. It depends on sort of what we talked about in class and what you think might be the case. And so now what we're going to do is we've got this data. We're going to actually test these hypotheses and answer this question. Are men more forgiving than women or not? Are women more empathetic than men or not? So in this data set that I downloaded from the website, we've got questions that measure forgiveness of others, emotional empathy, and forgiveness of self. So these first four questions measure forgiveness of others. And so these questions are like, it's hard for me to forgive those who've hurt me, or I'm able to make up pretty easily with friends who've hurt me in some way. Questions 5 through 8 measure forgiveness of self. I find it hard to forgive myself for things I've done, or it's easy to admit that I'm wrong. And then the last 4 questions measure emotional empathy. I get angry when I see someone being ill-treated, or I get emotionally involved in a friend's problems. Now, notice that these questions aren't worded all in the same direction, right? So the scale is a disagree-agree scale. Higher numbers for this question number 2, I have grudges I have held on for a long time. If you agree with that, then that means that you don't forgive. But higher numbers for question 4, I'm able to make up pretty easily. Higher numbers there mean you do forgive. So what we need to do first is we need to flip the scale on these reverse-coded questions. The questions that we're going to reverse are going to be questions 1, 2, 5, 6, 8, and 10. And what we're going to do is we're going to tell SPSS to flip the scale, so higher numbers always mean more forgiveness or more empathy. So for example, for question number 2, I have grudges I've held on to for long periods of times. We're going to flip this scale so that a 1 becomes a 5 and a 5 becomes a 1. A 4 becomes a 2 and a 2 becomes a 4 and so on. 3 stays the same. So there's a way to do this in SPSS in these menus up here, but I'm a giant nerd, and so I have some code that will do it for me. So this is my recode all of these variables. 1 becomes a 5, 2 becomes a 4, 3 stays a 3, 4 becomes a 2, and a 5 becomes a 1. And I'm going to recode it into different variables. So when I hit go, notice down here I've got a bunch new variables. And these new variables are the reverse coded version of the question. Okay. Now, for these concepts of forgiveness of others, forgiveness of self, and emotional empathy, what we're going to do is we're going to take the average of people's scores. Right? So we asked 4 questions about forgiveness of others, but we want to get one single item that represents people's score on forgiveness of others on a 1 to 5 scale. And the same thing for forgiveness of self. So for forgiveness of others, we're going to take the average of the reverse-coded question 1, reverse-coded question 2, and 3 and 4. And so this tells me what these questions are going to be. So we're going to take the average of all of them. Now notice down here I've got these new variables: forgiveness of others, forgiveness of self, and emotional empathy. And so the question that we're going to ask is, do men and women differ significantly on these 3 variables? So to do that, we're going to do an independent samples t-test. The reason why it's an independent samples t-test is because we have a dichotomous categorical independent variable in gender, and we have 3 dependent variables that are all continuous. So when I click on gender and click define groups, I have to tell SPSS what codes I'm using. So remember, 1 is for males, 2 is for females. And then I'm going to ask for this t-test. Click OK. And now we have this output. So here we've got forgiveness of others, males and females. In fact, what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to save this as a PDF so that we can zoom in a little bit so you can see it a little bit better on your screen. All right, so here's a PDF version of these results, and I'll post this PDF on Moodle. So we have our 3 independent stables t-tests here. We're looking at the difference between males and females on forgiveness of others, males and females on forgiveness of self, and emotional empathy. So the average here for females on forgiveness of others, females are slightly higher than males, forgiveness of others, 3.45 compared to 3.3. Females are slightly higher than males on forgiveness of self, and they're higher than males on emotional empathy. So this is the pattern that we're looking at. We got males and females. This is their mean. This is their standard deviation. On all 3 of these, females are higher than males. But the question is this significantly higher? So to that, we're going to look at the next box. Now, remember we talked about this in class. You can completely ignore the Levine's test box. So completely, you can just sort of X out. You don't need to look at this at all. And the thing we're going to be interested in is the T, the degrees of freedom, and the significance. So remember, there's 2 ways that we can assess the significance of a test. We can look up the critical value of T using the degrees of freedom, figure out what that critical value is, and then plot our T statistic on there. If it's in the body, it's not significant. If it's in the tails, it is significant. Or we can look at this significance value, this exact probability, and this is just a different way of doing it that'll get you to the same answer. So if you were to plot this, you would find that it's actually in the body because this here indicates that this is not statistically significant. So there is no so even though up here women did score higher than men on forgiveness of others, down here this is not a significant difference. Same thing with forgiveness of self, negative 1.12 degrees of freedom, 0.228. Remember the critical or the cutoff for statistical significance is p is less than 0.05. So 0.228 is above 0.05, 228 is above 50, 0.050. So we say that that's not statistically significant. So there is no significant difference between males and females on forgiveness of self, again, even though females had a higher average compared to males. But down here, looking at emotional empathy, there is a significant difference between males and females on emotional empathy. Women did have significantly higher emotional empathy compared to men. And we know this because this p-value 0.003 is less than 0.050. And if you plotted this out on a t-distribution using the critical value of t, you would find that this t-value is in the tails of that distribution. So these are the results of the lab. And then what you need to do next is start working on the lab number 1 write-up. So for the lab write-up, there's 3 things you need to include for the lab. Remembering that the lab is worth 2.5 homeworks, so it should be about 2.5 homeworks worth of work/effort that goes into the lab. The first section is a summary of the article. What did they do? Why did they do their study? What are the results? What did they find? What did they find in terms of their research hypotheses? Their research hypotheses are not explicitly stated, so it's up to you to use the information to figure that out. Then what you're going to do is you're going to state our research hypotheses, depending on what we talked about in class and what you think. And then you're going to write up the results of the t-tests in APA style. So remember, at the end of the slide, when we talked about independent samples, I went over exactly what an APA style results should look like. So you're going to want to make sure you look back at that for a template and where to pull the numbers from. Okay? You're going to write up those 3 results paragraphs of the 3 independent samples that we did. Then lastly, you're going to write a discussion section. You're going to compare and contrast our results. How are they similar? How are they different? What does this tell you about gender differences? What does this tell you about sort of the big picture? You should be shooting for a solid half a page to a page paragraph for each of these 3 sections. Okay. If you have any questions about the lab report, let me know. The lab reports will be due on the date that's indicated on the course calendar on the syllabus, and they will be turned in online. You don't need to print them out. You'll turn them in online to the Dropbox on Moodle.